I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
My guest today on the show is Michael Sobolik. He has a great new book out, Countering China's Great Game, A Strategy for American Dominance. This is a very crowded space. We've heard a lot of these conversations about countering China on this podcast, but what's so helpful about Michael's book and this conversation is we're focusing on this conversation through the lens of geopolitics and economics, primarily through the Belt and Road Initiative. We discuss why the Belt and Road Initiative did not live up to its hype, how it shifted in the 2020s, and how America should broadly, especially in the developing world, counter its strategy when it comes to China's attempt to dominate the globe.
The Belt and Road is entering its second stage. Xi Jinping is militarizing the Belt and Road. He is militarizing the inroads he has already secured over the past decade, and he is beginning to leverage economic and political beachheads in a number of these countries, and he is leveraging them to expand China's forward defense.
Hope you all enjoy the conversation, and a huge thank you to Hudson Institute for supporting the work of this podcast. Michael Sobolik, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Really great and excited to chat with you. So let's start here. I found it so interesting that your book, Countering China's Great Game, A Strategy of American Dominance, is so focused on the Belt and Road Initiative, because so much of 2020's China-US discourse has been centered around Taiwan. You obviously write about Taiwan, but you kind of take us back to the 2010s in a certain way by discussing the Belt and Road Initiative. Give us a good articulation to start off with why you focus so much of your attention on Belt and Road, a little different than the typical focus on Taiwan.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned Taiwan, Marshall. The introduction and conclusion of my book, Countering China's Great Game, are kind of all about Taiwan. I open with my trip to Taiwan a number of years ago and conclude with what does America need to do to make sure a war over Taiwan never happens? And curiously enough, those questions took me to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think the reason is because the Belt and Road is really a foreshadowing of the world that Xi Jinping wants to make, a foreshadowing of the world he wants to bring into existence. And I think it's a mistake, that Washington China analysts make regularly when we talk about China's foreign policy, and the Belt and Road in particular, as primarily an economic venture, or primarily in commercial transactional terms. When for your listeners who have heard of the Belt and Road, and it's possible there are some who haven't, it usually gets described as a collection of infrastructure projects, primarily in the global south, that China is funding in one way or another. And it's also often described as evidence that China is ascending in its foreign policy influence in parts of the world where the U.S. hasn't really been able to get a strong, decisive political foothold. That is a very accurate description of the Belt and Road from a decade ago. And as you said, Marshall, Belt and Road was a huge topic of focus in Washington, D.C. and all around the world a few years ago. But let's face it, it's not exactly the same project it used to be in terms of how much funding it gets from Beijing. That's partially a function of China's own economic woes. It's a function of the fallout from the COVID pandemic. But the warning that I try to sound quite loudly in my book is that the Belt and Road is entering its second stage. And I guess you could also say that China's foreign policy is entering its second stage as well. Xi Jinping is militarizing the Belt and Road. And that's why I'm so concerned about it. He is militarizing the inroads he has already secured over the past decade, And he is beginning to leverage economic and political beachheads in a number of these countries. And he is leveraging them to expand China's forward defense. You see this all throughout the world, and we can go region by region as the conversation goes on. But that's why I'm so concerned about it. It is quite expansive, and it's basically his attempt to do globally what he did very successfully in the South China Sea, which is militarize this huge body of water, but BRI is global. So that's why I'm so concerned about it.
A quote I'd like to pull from the book that gets at the evolution of our understanding of Belt and Road is, as you say, quote, the Belt and Road Initiative of 2016 was not the same Belt and Road Initiative in 2019, is not the same Belt and Road Initiative as we are discussing here in September 2024. What explains these shifting conceptions and, frankly, practicalities of what the actual initiative is?
If you are going to do what Xi Jinping did and write Belt and Road into the Constitution and have it be this premier foreign policy project, then you can't really allow it to fail. So I think, Marshall, partly there's a political explanation, which, as we both know, whether you're talking about politicians in the United States or politicians in authoritarian countries like the PRC, every politician knows how to be flexible. And if your pet project needs to succeed, then you need it to be flexible for you. So we've seen the Belt and Road kind of reinvent itself over its lifetime. It started off as the really hard infrastructure like roads, bridges, stadiums, stuff like that. Now it's primarily being retooled to focus on green energy. So it's partially a function of what investments have the highest rate of return, what's working, what's not working. But also, it's more than just domestic politics for Xi Jinping. It's also geopolitical. Once you build a certain number of roads and bridges, it's not that there aren't any more to build, but the return for building more gets less and less. China is not just out there to do favors to global South countries. They're trying to gain strategic footholds in key industries. And this is why you see the BRI getting retooled and refocused to look at renewable energy. This is a race that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party see as a key decisive technology in the 21st century. They are looking not only for their own interests to have a wide portfolio of energy because they're highly dependent on energy outside of China, but they also know that if they can gain key supply chain dominance, then they can dominate entire industries. And we're already seeing this with electric car batteries for electric vehicles. So I think there are at least those two reasons. It needs to work because Xi Jinping needs it to be successful for his own legacy. But there's also an actual real world element to it where there are new opportunities to exploit. And the BRI has been one of China's vehicles to try to seize on those opportunities.
Let's make the implicit explicit. As you helpfully articulated, a key political skill, regardless of style of government, is the ability to be flexible once the, reality meets the actual dream or effort you actually came up with. What could you explain in what ways did the 2010s era Belt and Road Initiative not live up to expectations in a way that required this rhetorical and industrial shift?
At least a couple of ways, Marshall. I think one, the early forecast for how big the Belt and Road was going to be was in the trillions. And that was a function of big sweeping statements that China made with promising notionally how much investment they were going to dump into a number of different countries. There was a delta between what China promised and what they delivered. So on the one hand, China in some ways failed to live up to its own propaganda about its own project. So that's one thing. I think a second reality is that in a lot of these countries that did not only that bought into the BRI, but received a lot of assistance and had a lot of projects get constructed, a lot of these countries have had some buyer's remorse. And the poster child of this is Sri Lanka, where they have a enormous sovereign debt crisis. Now, that's not only because of their relationship to Beijing, but it's a huge part of it. And you already see how Beijing is adjusting to these realities. They are in many instances saying, okay, so you can't pay off the loans. We will take a 99-year lease on the project itself. And now this is basically our territory for a century. And that has an audience cost to it. It's great in the short term because, again, go back to my main point of concern, Xi Jinping is leveraging the Belt and Road for geostrategic and military means now. And those land leases allow him to do that in some cases. But there's also an audience cost, right? And it's not a great story for the Chinese Communist Party to be telling to the world, if you don't pay up, we're going to seize your land and we're going to use it for the People's Liberation Army. So we've also seen the CCP roll out these related but separate ventures parallel to the Belt and Road that are really focused on the greatness of China's civilization. And honestly, this kind of gets to this broader story that and challenge that Xi Jinping has. It's not just expanding China's military footprint. It's not just exerting economic dominance. China has been in this search for its own version of soft power for a very long time. And the Belt and Road, initially, I think Xi Jinping probably thought this would be a way for us to expand people-to-people connections and to tell China's story well. And the Belt and Road has been kind of a mixed bag for China's soft power. There's honestly been a lot of bad stories about Beijing with this. So I think that also has been a big motive to retool the project in recent years.
Something I'm interested in, you were very specific when you mentioned investments. I would like to understand how we should understand investments from a BRI perspective, because obviously if you're spending money on projects, infrastructure, new forms of technology, like you mentioned, you could see a return on that. But if we're thinking about how the U.S. pursued the Marshall Plan in the wake of World War II, obviously that involved propping up the European economy. That obviously led to America having access to markets, but it also secured a broader geopolitical objective of securing a bulwark against Soviet expansion into Western Europe. So if you are looking at this from the PRC's perspective, how do they think of the investment side of things? Because you could say that all of these infrastructure projects could not create any traditional returns, yet if they end up locking the U.S. out at a geopolitical level across regions, that would be a return in of itself. So how should we think of this idea of investment?
The People's Republic of China is trying to rejigger the global economic orientation away from the West and towards the East. That was the initial barometer of success for the BRI. And in many cases, it has great potential to still do this. And to give an example of that, some of your listeners may be familiar with the geostrategic theoretician and historian from Great Britain in the previous century, Halford Mackinder. And Mackinder had this big theory of how international security worked. And his theory is the shorthand version of it is called the global island. And his theory at the beginning of the 20th century was that whoever controlled the heartland of Eurasia controlled the prime real estate of biggest continent of the world, and whoever controls Eurasia basically controls the entire globe. And the BRI is not exclusively a Mackinder-esque project because there's a huge emphasis on commercial shipping and sea lanes and all that stuff too. But I think if you look at a map of the Belt and Road, you cannot escape this really fundamental reality that China is trying to unite Eurasia economically on its own terms. There are 3 cross-continental trade routes that go from China to Europe and basically capture the entirety of Eurasia. You have the northern route that goes through Mongolia and Russia into the Baltics. You have the middle corridor that goes through Central Asia and the Caucasus. And then you have the Central Asian corridor that goes through the Central Asian states, Iran, and then ends in Turkey. And you have, it's not really redundancy, it's kind of a form of insurance, because Russia and Iran are geopolitically tenuous partners for a whole host of reasons. So China has different ways and different routes to establish these kinds of trade, economic investment, and people-to-people relationships that, in their theory, will culminate into a community with shared policies. And I think this is what gets lost with the Belt and Road a lot of the time. When Xi Jinping rolled out this project in 2013, he defined the BRI in 5 terms. The third term, contrary to popular belief, was infrastructure. We talk about the BRI as if it's all infrastructure. That was point 3 on Xi Jinping's original definition of what this whole thing is all about. The first pillar is policy coordination between governments. That is the goal of what China has always been out to build and foster with the Belt and Road. They, in many ways, as I write in my book, it is really this manifestation of a modern form of tribute system. And there are a whole lot of imperial echoes of China's dynastic foreign policies that you see with the Belt and Road. And it helps you understand the what I would argue to be the real intent of this project.
And now everyone's thinking this, what is the second plank then?
If the first plank was policy coordination, a number of the others was eliminating barriers to cross-border trade. I think that was number 2. And then number 3 was infrastructure. And then the 4th pillar was increased use of local currencies, which is a really low-key way of saying, let's try to find alternative methods to the US dollar to fulfill transactions. And then the 5th are people-to-people exchanges. And this, especially if you look at Africa, you see Confucius institutes all across the continent, and you see Chinese state media propagandizing these people-to-people relationships on a daily basis. And I think you also see this in the Middle East, with Egypt in particular, that the Belt and Road is not just a government link, it's not just a commercial link, it's a people-to-people link. And it is really this holistic approach to build what Xi Jinping calls a community of common destiny for all mankind. We really do ourselves a disservice if we think of the BRI exclusively in economic terms. I would argue it's first and foremost a geopolitical strategic venture, but really, to give it its due credit, it is this holistic endeavor that is the PRC's vision for 21st century life.
And something I am curious about as you're articulating this, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the idea that one of the objectives of BRI was pushing the economic center closer to Asia, away from the West. One doesn't need to be a PRC apparatchik to think that that's something that's historically inevitable. If we look at population growth, economic activity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to what degree, as we sit from the American perspective, do we have to recognize that some sort of shift is inevitable relative to whatever the PRC is up to?
I mean, listen, this might be apocryphal, but Napoleon is thought to have said, let China sleep, for when she wakes, she'll rule the world. And I think there were a lot of American leaders, politicians, and strategists in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that really took that to heart, for better or for worse, right? You have Henry Kissinger, when he was President Nixon's national security advisor, basically making peace with this reality and making the strategic gamble in the 70s that America needed not just good relations with China, that we needed to be aligned in one way or another with the PRC for those exact reasons that you laid out. And subsequent presidents made the same case. I think this was during, don't quote me on this because my memory's a little hazy, but I think this was during the Reagan administration when George H.W. Bush was then the vice president. there was this big debate over Taiwan policy. I think it was over Taiwan arms sales. And then Vice President Bush made the case to one of Reagan's senior advisors that you need to think in the long run about which party matters more to America. And his argument was that China is going to matter more strategically than Taiwan is going to matter. So I think a few decades ago, a lot of leaders did kind of buy into what they thought was this reality that eventually, look, the winds are going to start blowing in China's direction again, and we need to get ahead of the curve to make sure that we're not caught flat-footed. And like, listen, America doubled down on China for decades. Like, we extended permanent normal trade relations with them. We led the case to get them into the World Trade Organization. And the awkward reality is, I mean, what do we have to show for that? We have theft of intellectual property that's calculated in the trillions of dollars. We have American companies arming the Chinese Communist Party with technology that's then leveraged for gross atrocities of human rights in China and around the world. And we have our own security interests threatened, not just in key regions of the globe, but targeting our own democracy at home at the hands of the CCP. TikTok is a great example of that. So this kind of awkward question is, on the one hand, yes, historically, China was the dominant actor in its neighborhood, and it's very natural for any country to seek regional hegemony. Like, look at American history. We've done that in our own hemisphere too. But you also need to account for what type of world are you or is another government trying to make. And I think the way you treat your own people is the best barometer for how you're going to treat the rest of the world. And the Chinese Communist Party doesn't really try to hide this. It's a brutal Leninist regime. And on the one hand, historically, yeah, there could be a reversion to the norm, but that's not necessarily in America's interests. And this is where I lay out a plan in the book for how we need to make sure that the CCP is not in a dominant position.
I'd like to double click on that Reagan administration anecdote you offered, because I think it gets at an interesting dilemma when we try to focus American foreign policy on specific interests. Not to say that could be wrong, but from the perspective of the 1980s, before obviously America lost its chips industry, when we were more focused on economic competition with Japan, I could see sitting from the perspective of the then vice president thinking, to what degree are we going to want to have the U.S. relationship with China be dictated by the outcome of a civil war towards the tail end of World War II going into the 1950s? Obviously, though, the conversation on China and Taiwan has entirely changed from the perspective of the 2020s, but that's just such an interesting snapshot how even his very reasonable question at the time would just entirely shift within a 10-year period because the existing trend that made his assumption make sense completely shifted.
Leaders like George H.W. Bush, for whom personally I have a great deal of respect. I'm a graduate of the Bush School at Texas A&M. And I think that in terms of just a leader, I have the utmost respect for him. I do think he missed a lot of opportunities to re-examine his prior assumptions about China, though. And one such opportunity he had was 1989 with the Tiananmen Square massacre in June. As vice president, he and several others made as you say, Marshall, and I think there's a great argument to be made that at the time, it's very understandable why a lot of American politicians and strategists thought that China was the long-term strategic play. With Tiananmen Square, you had this moment where for the past few years, Deng Xiaoping had been telling not just the Americans, but the whole world that China's reforming. We are opening up as a country. We are modernizing economically. And then suddenly you see People's Liberation Army tanks literally running over students in broad daylight and right in the heart of China's cultural and political capital, in Beijing. And with zero remorse. With total commitment to political dictatorship. And we had this opportunity where we could have stepped back and asked ourselves, do we understand this regime as well as we thought we did? Do we have the kind of influence over them as we thought we did? Instead, President Bush, in an Oval Office press conference on or the day after June 4th in 1989, he's asked about this. And he basically said, listen, we need to tread lightly and be careful. This is an ancient civilization with a lot of pride and a lot of wounds from the West in their history, and we don't want to push them too hard right now. As simple as this may sound, what I would proffer is that two things can be true at the same time. Yes, China's history is one where European countries in particular did exploit China, especially in the 19th century. And yes, those wounds are still alive. I can tell you from when I was a congressional staffer and would meet with Chinese embassy representatives, like those memories are still alive and well. That also doesn't excuse you or give you a blank check to kill your own people in the streets and then to point your finger and play the whataboutism game. Like I think we also saw this when American politicians would ask China about the Uyghur genocide happening right now. Their response was, well, look at what you did to Native Americans. Yes, like we did horrible things to Native tribes in the United States in the 19th century. That doesn't excuse you for conducting a genocide today. Like there's something called personal responsibility and higher standards. And I wish that in those moments, at those key moments, that we would have re-examined our priors and asked ourselves not just those moral questions, but really, Marshall, those strategic questions of, is this a regime that's going to be with us down the road? And as history has turned out, we double down, and the CCP is not only not with us, they are against us today.
Before we get to the American side of this conversation moving forward, I'd be curious, you've mentioned human rights. You could very much tell the story of U.S. policy towards China, post-Cold War, starting in Tiananmen, the context of human rights debates. This is a very open question at this moment right now. Even amongst folks who could be described as China hawks, there's a disagreement about the degree to which China's internal human rights policies should set and determine the relationship and our approach to China itself. What is your sort of take on that issue?
I have a difficult time containing my frustration whenever human rights and geopolitics are described as two completely separate areas of concern with no overlap. I think that's often how they're talked about in Washington. It's interesting. I was actually at the Hudson Institute in April during the month of my book launch, and I was speaking with one of your colleagues, Olivia Enos, about this very question. And I remember during that event, what I said then and what I'll say again today, and what I still believe so strongly, is that it is not only about America's character and our values that we stand for human rights. It is a wise thing strategically for us to do. If you're Xi Jinping and your Belt and Road Initiative can only function properly if you committed genocide in your westernmost territory, so you have total control over commercial transactions flowing through that region, that is not a sign of strength. It is not a sign that your regime has legitimacy or control. And I think those are weaknesses that make a lot of sense for America to highlight and exploit. I get into a lot of specifics of what that could look like in the second half of my book, but suffice it to say, standing on principle is the right thing to do. But America also has an asymmetric advantage when it comes to human rights. We value the sanctity of the individual. We value the sanctity of human life. And that is something that the Chinese Communist Party does not do. And it turns out that if you don't value human life in that way, you tend to pursue policies that are self-defeating for the CCP. Why we leave that leverage on the table baffles me. It boggles my mind. And it is not only a rhetorical diplomatic advantage we have, There are actually material advantages we have that we can leverage, but we need to be willing to stand up and not just pay lip service to human rights and bring them up in high-level meetings. That's box checking. If we value this stuff, we need to do something about it.
So before we get into this last section, I want to offer a word of humility when it comes to policymakers in the DC op-ed industrial complex. So I think if we were recording this conversation in 2016, and this is taking Trump completely out of the 2016 conversation, we would say, or I would say some version of, look, Michael, China has the Made in China 2025 program. They have the Belt and Road Initiative. These are short, medium, and long-term, far-reaching efforts. Clearly, there is neither the consensus nor the ambition in American policy circles. We need our own version of Belt and Road. We need our own version of Made in America 2025. Now that we're sitting almost 8 years later, though, we could see that in various ways you've already described when it comes to Belt and Road Initiative, and of course, when it comes to Made in China 2025, these two ambitious efforts have not met various attainable or articulated benchmarks. So how should we sort of reconcile our recognition that planning is important and ambition is important, but it's not quite clear that just sort of copying that framework would have been the right and successful model moving forward?
This question is so important, and I'm glad that you're raising this, Marshall, because I think Washington has felt a great deal of pressure to come up with an alternative for global South nations in particular. And listen, if you are an American Secretary of State and you're knocking on the door of your counterparts in Brussels, Berlin, London, and Paris, and saying, please don't use Huawei in your telecommunications, or please do something about TikTok and CCP disinformation inside of your own country, I have zero sympathy for wealthy European democracies who are lazy and not wanting to do hard things to counter the CCP. And I think we're totally in our rights to say you need to do the hard work. But for a lot of these nations that are caught between America and China and don't have the luxury of great wealth like Europe does, or maybe that America does, I think that there's this pressure that a lot of Americans have felt of, we need to offer an alternative to Huawei. Or pick your problem set. But the question is how, right? Because whenever, like, for instance, I had a conversation with some diplomats from a Central Asian embassy a couple of years ago, and I write about this in the book. I asked them, how is America doing with offering an alternative to the BRI in your country? And he said, well, let me tell you, the last project that American and Chinese companies were competing on, the Chinese interest rate that they quoted us was 2%, and the US interest rate was 14%. That's not a credible choice at all. And that is, granted, one anecdote, but it speaks to this broader problem of America hasn't really come up with this alternative. But it's important to look under the hood and to ask ourselves some questions there. Because number one, as you alluded to, there's a great deal of buyer's remorse with the Belt and Road. Part of that is debt entrapment. Part of it is incomplete, languishing projects that are nowhere close to being finished. Look at the China-Pakistan economic corridor as the poster child of this problem. But there's also this question of design. China primarily uses loans for these programs. They do not care about sustainable development anywhere. That's not their objective. One of their biggest objectives is to export their excess capacity and excess labor to make sure that overproduction is accounted for in one way or another. And they do that by shipping it outside of their own borders. And they also want to make sure that there are enough jobs to go around in China. And that's why they're exporting laborers for these Belt and Road projects. And local communities are not benefiting. And a lot of the remittances are getting sent back to China and not getting invested in these domestic economies. In Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East, pick your country. There's reporting in Djibouti about how this is a huge problem for the local population. So I think on the one hand, the CCP's own failures with the BRI alleviate some of that pressure. And I think it helps America make a really good case, which is, listen, there's a reason a lot of these very unstable governments, maybe in Africa, for example, have been hesitant to work with USAID on development projects. It's because we have good governance markers. We have anti-corruption benchmarks. This is how the United States approaches foreign development. We want strong governments, free populations, and sustainable economies over time. Like, the whole goal of American development is to get it started and then let go of it and let it sustain itself. And that is not how China is approaching the Belt and Road at all. I think that there's some unanswered questions with this approach, because you need buy-in for governments and from local populations. And usually it's the government that's the problem, that they don't have interest in anti-corruption benchmarks or good governance standards. But China's failures with the Belt and Road strengthen America's case, I do think. I'm open to the idea that on the margin, we might need to give a little in some of these circumstances and be a little more flexible. I'm open to that conversation. But I also think that America has honorable and frankly, like, for these communities and for these nations, it is a good thing to try to help them move towards sustainable development. And I don't think that's something we should prematurely jettison just to try to outcompete China. I think that would be a short-term solution to some long-term problems.
Something I'm curious about then is, and obviously I don't want to give the entire book away, nor do I expect you to as well too, what would be your top line articulation then of how the U.S. should counter this geopolitical approach then?
I think in some ways it's a mistake for American strategists to get too hung up on the question of how do we offer a credible alternative. It is important, and inevitably when I travel and speak at different college campuses in America, like, even young students will intuitively zero in on this problem set. And the reason we don't really have an alternative yet is because it's hard, right? Like, there's no silver bullet, which is why when I wrote this book, I guess one thing I was trying to do was to work smarter and not harder. And one of the ways you do that in geopolitics is you think asymmetrically and not only symmetrically. If we are trying to offer an alternative to China's BRI, that is a symmetric competition where you're both competing on foreign development or foreign aid in one way or another. But American foreign policy, when it comes to securing our own interests, is not only about what we're building, it's about what we're countering. And the Belt and Road Initiative and the broader ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party threaten the United States and our allies and partners. And I make the case in chapter 3 of the book that one of the primary ways Beijing has leveraged the BRI is to alienate Taiwan and to soften the terrain for what eventually might be a military operation against the island. So if we want to try to weaken the CCP's ability to bring that day about, it's more than just deterrence, and it's more than just competing economically. We need to actually exploit the weaknesses in China's own strategy. And this is what a lot of Chinese theorists throughout history have described, and I think America is quick to forget. You attack the strategy of your opponent and not just the results of the strategy. Like, you don't just play whack-a-mole in great power competition. You go for the jugular of what your opponent is trying to do. And chapters 5 and 6 in my book are doing that. In chapter 5, I talk about the Belt and Road Initiative's weaknesses globally. In chapter 6, which I think is probably the most subversive chapter in the book, talks about the roots of the Belt and Road leading back to China itself, and where China is vulnerable within its own borders and what the United States needs to do. And I'll say just a couple words about that since you asked for specifics. The Chinese Communist Party is exporting censorship and surveillance capabilities through their digital Silk Road, which is the technological component of the Belt and Road, not only because they want to export China's model of governance, but because they want other countries that are friendly to the PRC to control speech about China and their own borders. And this is the insidious nature of the CCP. They define national security as the absence of threats, which is a really totalitarian way to think about national security. Like, Americans think about managing threats or mitigating threats. The CCP wants no threats to exist at all to its existence. And that, to me, signals not only like it's impressive that they have the technology to do what they do to censor information and speech, but it also suggests that they're deathly afraid of free speech. So one of the things that I think we need to do as a counter BRI strategy is to go to the heartbeat of this. It's not just the fact that Middle Eastern countries have Huawei and ZTE in their telecommunication systems. Trace it back to the root. If the real problem is the censorship of information and the ability to control what people are saying through various platforms like WeChat or the Chinese internet with a great firewall censorship, that's what we need to target. We need to make it harder and more expensive and more difficult for the party to control information within its own borders. We need to be willing to go to that level of brinksmanship and competition to divert the Chinese Communist Party's focus, looking for outward expansion like Taiwan, and to turn them inward to focus on problems within their own borders. We have to be willing to go there, I think.
That is the perfect place to end. The book is Countering China's Great Game, a strategy for American dominance. Michael, thank you for joining us on Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks, Marshall. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.